Welcome to the first module, and was the opening of almost everything you wanted to know about data but were afraid to ask, a journey for special educators. So I'm glad to have you here today. This is a topic kind of near and dear to my heart that I'm keen to kind of share with you, in part because after doing kind of work with schools and incredible educators and clinicians and therapists and people in related services and administrators for about 10 years now. It's turned out to be an incredibly interesting journey for me of trying to learn deeply about both what people want to do with evidence and some of the challenges they have. So this series of modules around data and evidence was really designed to help people understand some of the core pieces of what goes into collecting data, using data, and so forth. So let's dig in. So the first thing that to me is fundamental about the role of data in special education is that we want to be constantly thinking about certain kinds of questions. So the starting off here is just about questions, questions, and questions. And I'm sure many of you will have many questions to ask of the modules that will be coming. What's clear is that over the course of your careers, you have been handed often the task of collecting data or looking at data for patterns, using it to guide your understanding. And along that path, there are many questions that arise about the nature of the data you have or want to collect or want to use. What I want to do today is frame the conversation in terms of 4 different kinds of questions that will really fuel all the modules ahead and certainly help shape the conversation we will have in this opening module. The first question is, why collect data at all? Now the answer to this question will come from a lot of different directions and will depend on kind of who's asking the question, who may be responsible for answering it. So for example, one reason why we collect data is because we have both federal and state mandates about collecting certain kinds of evidence to guide what both the United States government, in the case of the U.S., and certain states within the United States require in terms of understanding whether children are obtaining the necessary ingredients to have what's considered a well-educated mind. So there'll be mandates coming down from the state, whether it's state testing, whether it's data on attendance or grades, or in cases, for example, in certain programs that focus on students with emotional disabilities, it might be certain things like levels of support or indicators of physical aggression, restraints, and so forth. Okay, so that's kind of one answer to a why question, but there may be other ones, right? So why collect data? Because, for example, the IEP is a document that federally mandates certain kinds of evidence to address the goals and objectives and benchmarks that are indicated within the IEP. So the first question is, why collect it? And the answer to that question comes from kind of who we're thinking about in terms of data that we need to satisfy to answer certain kinds of issues. The second type of question is what? Once we have an understanding of why we're collecting it to begin with, in other words, who's requiring us to collect it, and that may be ourselves, it may be the state, and so forth, then the question becomes, what kind of data do we want to collect? Now again, if it's something that's coming in from the United States government, so it's a federal mandate or a state mandate, we may be handed the kind of data that we need to collect. So if it's attendance, it's the number of days presence or absence. If it's grades, it's maybe on a certain kind of scale. If it's social emotional data, number of perhaps suspensions or restraints or time off learning, it's other kind of data. So once we understand the kinds of issues that we're trying to address with the why question, then we focus on what kind of data would best satisfy that kind of requirement. Once we understand kind of what we're collecting, then the question becomes, how are we collecting it, right? So this is a question about methods. So how are we collecting our assessments or our evaluations or our tests, right? Who's administering them? When are they administering them? What kind of methods of reliability and consistency do we have with our methodologies? So those are questions about methods that address this how question. The last question is also a how question, but it's how do we use the data? Okay? So once we've got the data that we know addresses the why question, and we've developed our methodologies and we're collecting it, now the question is, well, what do we do with it? So one thing is we might just send it back to the Department of Education, right? They ask for it, we're going to give it to them. It might be that we're using it to evaluate whether the level of support we're giving children allows them to close the gaps in terms of the demands that happen within a school environment, be they physical, academic, conceptual, social, emotional, and so forth. So we have 4 questions. Why collect data? What data to collect? How should we collect it? And how should we use it? And today, we'll be working through some of these issues in more detail, but they'll form the basis for the modules that follow. What I want to be clear up front in these modules, in particular today, is what these series of conversations I'll be having with you are not. This is not an introduction to statistics. So for those of you who have gone through a teacher program or through college, or maybe even an advanced class, you may have already had a course in statistics. That's what this is not about. It is not a course on statistics. It is also not a detailed course on methodology, okay, which may also come into a course on statistics. But you may have very clear classwork that is dedicated to methodology, right? How do you actually determine validity or reliability or consistency? What this course is the nuts and bolts of basically understanding how to collect data. And the way I think of this is really a course which is like a conversation. I want to have a conversation with you the way I've had conversation for the last 10 or more years with educators, be they teachers or clinicians or counselors or therapists or administrators. They're conversations that happen kind of in the moment and therefore are really the nuts and bolts about what you need to be an educator who both cares about evidence, understands why to collect evidence, understands how to collect evidence, and understands how to use it. At the bare bones minimum, right? This is the basic stuff you think you'll need to be successful in using evidence. So let's dig in here, and we're going to start with the why question, and that is why collect data to begin with. So as I mentioned in the opening, one answer to the why question is that there are certain regulations which departments of education impose on schools, and they may have to do with understanding things like attendance or suspensions or restraints or level of support, various kinds of accommodation, right? There are all sorts of mandates that will come down from the Department of Education that are requirements that a school must fulfill, whether it's federal or state. So that's one kind of why. A second one is that, of course, the IEP itself is a federal mandate to collect evidence that addresses, during progress reports, whether they be short-term or long-term, the goals, objectives, and benchmarks that are within the IEP. So when someone writes an objective with a benchmark, such as a student will be able to use coping skills when they're frustrated on 80% of all observations, that's a statement about evidence, right? You must bring to bear evidence that shows that the child has either met that benchmark or has not. A third type of why question is that we collect data to assess baselines and measures of growth, right? So again, clearly linked to the IEP, we have a current performance, which in some sense can serve as the baseline for setting subsequent benchmarks, right? And it's also a way we determine growth. A child comes in, we do a preliminary, let's say, test on their math or reading abilities or their ability to physically move from one location to another. We generate that information and we use that to set growth targets, right? Where we want them to be by a certain date. Okay? So evidence is answering the question why, to establish baselines and to establish measures of growth. A fourth type of why is to guide instruction, right? So I'm teaching. I want to get a sense of how my instruction is helping children learn, whatever the system of learning that we're targeting, whether it's an academic measure or it's a social emotional one, a physical one, or motor one, some kind of sensory issue, right? So I need to collect evidence as an educator for my own feedback to see whether I'm effective in basically creating growth in that child. And then we, of course, always use evidence, or we should use evidence, to assess the effectiveness of our interventions. We design an intervention, we launch that intervention, we collect some more data, and we look at the data to see if it's basically supporting the impact that we predict will come forward if the intervention is successful. So the little cartoon here is, you have to solve this problem by yourself. You can't call tech support, right? So if I've been effective, tech support isn't the answer for the intervention. You, your own brain, is what will be effective. And then lastly, but certainly not least, in many programs, there's been a movement over the last few years to develop what are called early warning systems, right, or early warning indicators. These are basically ways of indicating when students are kind of on target in the blue and green area here, so good standing, excelling, or are kind of maybe at risk, kind of in the warning zone, yellow and orange, or are critical, basically are kind of failing at some measure, right, not doing well in the system. So we collect evidence, right, to address those, whether they're absences in the school or failing grades or whatever they may be. Those early warning indicators are critical in terms of linking evidence to interventions that are necessary for individuals, for example, who are in the red, orange, or yellow. So these are the kinds of questions that are relevant to the why in terms of evidence. What about what? What kind of data should people be collecting? So the first part is clearly evidence has to be relevant. It has to be relevant to the question. So if the Department of Education says, please collect data on attendance, then data on attendance is clearly relevant because that's addressing the question that is mandated by the Department of Education, right? But when it comes to things like the IEP, the data, of course, has to be relevant to the kind of goal or objective that one's collecting. So if one's collecting an ELA goal on a child's ability to recognize, let's say, letters of the alphabet, to both identify them and verbalize their sound, then the relevant data would be data on accuracy of identifying and ability to articulate that sound. Okay? If it was a social emotional goal, like reducing the level of self-injurious behaviors, then clearly one has to define self-injurious behaviors and assess that during the day. It also has to be meaningful, and again, what's meaningful is going to vary depending on who's making a request or a demand for the data. For example, there may be things that the Department of Education is requiring that you yourself don't find meaningful because it doesn't necessarily guide your own work. But it's, of course, meaningful to the state because they need it for their own measures and assessments. Okay? But if you're collecting your own data that you're designing to, let's say, guide instruction or to address an IEP, it has to be meaningful in that it guides that kind of work. There are different kinds of data. Obviously, this is sort of about the structure of data. And what I'll focus on now is different kinds of scales of measurement. And again, these are things that will go into much greater detail in the later modules. This is meant to be an introduction at the highest of levels. So once it's kind of relevant and meaningful, then the question is, what does the structure of the data look like? Well, one kind of scale of measurement are a class of scales called numerical scales. And these are actual numbers, be they integers or decimals or percentages. And here are just a kind of a sampling of them that we'll be talking about. But to compare, numerical is a second type of scale, and those are categorical scales. And these are more scales that have kind of options along some kind of line, imaginary line, right? Where at one end you have something that's maybe the lowest or worst end of the spectrum, and at the top you might have the best or the highest. It could also be kind of level of support, But these are categorical scales. Rather than having specific numbers like integers, they're words along some kind of continuum. Okay? So here are some examples. Of numerical scales, it could be a count, right? You're counting the number of times something occurs. Or it could be a rate, right? The number of times divided by some period of time. Or it could be a percentage, right? So here's a case of pizza. Over 94% of people in the U.S. like eating pizza, right? So some percentage, something out of something times 100 will give the percentage. Or it could be a duration. How long does something last, right? The duration of time a child spends being non-compliant. Or it could be the distance moved. So for children with physical disabilities, you may be assessing how far they moved, right, in what period of time, so it would be a rate, and so forth. So these are all numerical scales in the sense that they're actual numbers. Categorical scales, and there are a variety of them, but they could be things like quality, right? So yay or nay, right? Or it could be something like poor, fair, good, or excellent. Categorical scales might be actually frequency-based. Something occurred not at all, never, rarely, sometimes, and often. And categorical scales that are frequency-based could actually be defined much more precisely. So never, clearly it happens 0, rarely 1 to 2 times, sometimes 3 to 4, and often 5 or more. Okay? Emotions or zones could be scales. So zones of regulation, here's an example of it, blue, green, yellow, and red, where blue is kind of tired and down or okay, and green is kind of happy, content. Yellow is kind of on the edge, on the fence, right? A little bit agitated, a little bit dysregulated, and red is obviously very dysregulated. Okay, so again, a categorical scale that maps on to different emotions. It could be kind of the support types, right? So a hierarchy of prompts from kind of full physical support to gestural, verbal, up until independent, okay? Or a support level, right? It could be, I'm giving you 1 prompt, 2 prompts, 3 prompts, and so forth, okay? So here what we have are a series of possibilities to answer the what question. Right? So what kind of data are we going to collect? And obviously these are the kinds of pieces of information that I'll go into much greater detail in some of the later modules. Once we've got answers to the why and the what, we turn to the how, right? How to collect the relevant data. So the way I like to think about how questions is really kind of like a manual or a handbook, right? So if we have a manual or handbook, it tells us, if it's good, right, step by step what we have to do, right? So when we're writing out the methodologies for collecting information, and let's say we're giving it to various staff who may be responsible, we want to make sure they know exactly what to do, how, when, and where. So the best kinds of methodologies are written like a how-to manual where you can pick it up and follow along and boom, you know how to do it. Once that's spelled out, then the question is, how are we actually going to collect this information? Now in many programs, it's paper and pencil, right? So they've got a check sheet or they've got a data sheet on a clipboard, and they're simply marking down by pencil on a piece of paper, which has a formatted way of entering the information. People might have open a tablet with a spreadsheet on or a computer, right? And you're entering numbers directly into an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheet. Or you may have some software application, let's say on a tablet or a smartphone or a laptop or a desktop, where you can directly enter the information into that digital system. Okay, so this is kind of the mode in which data is being kind of gathered. An important piece of this is that even when you've written out your manual, right, your methodology, it's important to be able to have additional methods that check on the reliability of your methods, right? Are you collecting it in a reliable way? And if you're doing it with multiple staff who are also responsible for collecting data, you want to make sure that you're also reliable, right? That you're all doing it in sort of the same way. Now, in some cases, right, there may be normed information, it may be a standardized methodology, and there may be information already on how reliable it is, or there may be guidelines. But if you're creating tools to collect information, let's say in an IEP, typically you're writing out your methodology and you want to make sure that they're reliable among the staff who are collecting them, that you're consistent. Now, an important piece of this, and this is an important piece of methodology that's often not mentioned or considered, but it's the ways in which cognitive biases that we're all subjected to can unconsciously, in many cases, impact the kind of data we collect. So what do I mean by cognitive bias? So here's a little Calvin and Hobbes. Hobbes says to Calvin, "Aren't you supposed to be doing your homework?" And Calvin says, "I'm pretty sure the assessment was optional." "Denial springs eternal," says Hobbes. "It's not denial. I'm just very subjective about the reality I accept." Okay, so that's kind of a twist on the cognitive bias, but here it is more specifically. A cognitive bias is a tendency or a pattern of systematic errors that deviate from what would be considered to be rational. Okay? These can affect your decision making, your behavior, your judgment, your perception, your memory. Okay? So there's a whole family of cognitive biases, but I want to mention them here because they can intrude in kind of nasty ways into the kind of data you collect. And I'm just going to give you an example from a school that I've been working with for a long time. This was in the early days, but it was kind of a nice example. So it was a Monday, I believe, and I was about to go and visit the school on a Wednesday, and they had a data collection system that collected information on basically when students had time off learning. Either they took a self-initiated break, or there was a staff-directed break when they did something that was kind of against school rules or policy, and they collected a lot of information that's along with data on restraints. And so on Monday, I contacted the head of the school and said, I just want to make sure they were okay for coming in on Wednesday and having a discussion about the data and lots of other things. And he said, yeah, that's fine. I said, just to let you know, though, Wednesdays is our worst day. We always have quite a lot of staff-directed breaks. We have restraints more on Wednesdays than other days of the week. So, it's often a day where our staff are kind of distracted and a little bit agitated, but, I just want to let you know that. But it's fine. It's okay. So I decided to take a look at the data because it was this nice digital system, and I could look at the data with them. And when I ran the analyses to look for this supposed Wednesday effect, there was no Wednesday effect. In fact, the day of the week that was consistently worse than the others was Tuesdays. So when I got to the school, I said, Wednesday, it's a bad day, right? And they said, oh, God, it's always horrible. I said, well, I can show you the data, right? So I plotted the numbers by day of the week and showed them it was Tuesdays, and they were all like shocked. The reason I bring this up is because biases like that, which can be either conscious or unconscious, can greatly affect how you interact with students. Okay? So even though Wednesdays wasn't the worst day, if they believe it is, their anxiety will be higher, and that will impact how they interact with those students. So it's important to be checking the possible biases that we may have, as they may intrude not only in our assessments or evaluations of students, but also on how we interact with them. The last how is how we can use the data to detect basically patterns, right? So now it's about use of data. So we've got the why collect data, what to collect, and how to collect it, and now we end with how to use it. So I'm going to bring up again the notion of relevancy, which is that if the data are not relevant, then lose it, right? So only collect data because you're going to use it to answer some kind of question, right? It's relevant to the Department of Education, it's relevant to the IEP, it's relevant to you as a teacher or clinician or administrator. So if it's relevant and it guides your work, then keep it because you're going to use it to guide that initiative. Now, how to use it really invokes the notion of time, right? So how to use it is not just a matter of popping open a computer and looking at something. The how is looking at patterns, trying to understand them, and guide your insights into a child's growth or lack thereof, right? What's going on? And that requires time. I mention this strongly here because often I go to schools where administrators have given their staff a lot of time to collect data, but have not allocated time to think about it, reflect on it, stare at the patterns, try to understand what's going on, and then use that data to guide instruction. Okay, so time is critical here. The patterns, which are ultimately what we're looking for, is trying to understand what the data is telling us, right? The data tells us a story, right? And we want to try to understand that story. So in a case like this where we've got, a number of different dots, and let's say the x-axis or horizontal axis is time, and let's say the skill of the child is on the vertical or y-axis, this is a child who's bouncing all around. The question is why, right? Why are we getting this kind of variation? We're trying to understand, is this having to do with day of the week, time of day, which staff member is interacting with that student during the evaluation or observation or assessment, right? So the patterns are there, and we're trying to pull them apart to understand what's going on with the system. We use data to assess growth, right? So we want to chart something and say, okay, unlike this pattern over here where it's kind of all over the place, here's a student who's showing growth, right? They're increasing over time. That's a growth measure. We also use data to basically assess or evaluate our benchmarks, right? So if our benchmark is stated as 4 out of 5 observations, a student will do something, right? Will look both ways for safety when they're crossing the street, will get at least 80% or better on some kind of ELA assignment, or whatever it may be, right? That's using data to assess whether the child has met that benchmark. And then lastly, we use the data to guide our instruction, right? So I give an assignment, right? And if everybody gets an A, I mean, in some sense that's good, but we want variability, right? A good test should capture the variation in ability, right? So if everybody gets an A, knowing that basically not everybody is an A student, there's got to be some variation, right? I didn't create a good test. In the same way that everybody fails, I also didn't create a good test. So I expect a test to capture some kind of variation, and so I'm using the evidence about variation to guide my level of instruction. So in a nutshell, and to kind of sum up this opening welcoming module, this is really about digging in to the data and what data is all about in special education. My goal is to not make this hard, right? I really want to make this a conversation. I want to make it easy for you to get that treasure chest of understanding. That's what I hope. I'm glad you've joined in. I look forward to working with you.